And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com.
Tickets for IU basketball are available online at iuhoosiers.com or by calling 866-IU-SPORTS. The three remaining winter break games are December the 18th against Fort Wayne, December 21st against Tennessee Tech, and December 28th against Youngstown State. IU basketball tickets make for great holiday gifts. Be sure to visit us online at iuhoosiers.com or get your tickets by calling 866-IU-SPORTS. Go IU!
On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich joins me, and we take Alex's 5 takeaways column that you've seen regularly on Inside the Hall and apply that to a podcast. And so we talk about basically our 5 biggest takeaways, really 6 because there's a bonus one, about the early part of the season, talking about our biggest takeaway from the team overall, our biggest takeaway about Archie Miller as a coach, talk about Deron Davis, Robert Johnson, all the notable players for the Hoosiers. And then we also talk a little bit of recruiting at the end. All of that coming here on this edition of Podcast on the Brink. Thanks for being here. Buying tickets to sports and concerts can be complicated and confusing, but there is a better way to buy, and that is with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to every type of live event. Whether you're searching for a last-minute deal, planning a night out, or need to find the perfect gift, SeatGeek helps you find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed. There is nothing quite like seeing your favorite team or musician in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for a great value. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone. I can vouch that it is by far the easiest way that I have found to shop for tickets. I can be anywhere, and with just a few taps, I can instantly find seats. I'm planning on doing that with my wife. We have a 17-month-old, but we're planning some date nights out, and one of the things we're going to do is look for some musicians that we want to see, and SeatGeek will be the first place that we go to look for concert tickets here in Dallas where we live, so hopefully we can find some, because we know if they're there, and if there are good prices, then we will find them on SeatGeek, because SeatGeek is designed to make your ticket buying experience easier than ever. SeatGeek saves you time and money by searching multiple ticket sites to compare prices and help you find amazing deals. And best of all, Podcast on the Brink listeners get $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. Just download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK today, BRINK, for $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. All right, and I'm joined on this episode of Podcast on the Brink, as I always am, by Alex Bozich of Inside the Hall. Alex, Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. This is kind of our episode in between Christmas and New Year, so I wish you a happy both.
Same to you, Jerod. It's always good to chat just the two of us, and I was actually looking through some of the recent download numbers, and not to brag on the two-man pod, but I think we had one of our stronger podcasts in terms of download numbers recently when it was just the two of us. So let's see if we can keep that up with today's episode. I know there's a lot of interesting things. You sent me a pretty detailed email earlier, a lot of fun things to dive into and discuss, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on some of these topics as well.
Yeah, well, you obviously, after every game, you do 5 takeaways on the game, and so I kind of thought, this is an interesting time. I mean, we know that games have been coming fast and furious all season long, and so this has been the longest gap, and I think it's given everybody a chance to kind of, step back, catch your breath a little bit, reflect on what we've seen over the first 13 games, and then obviously, kind of wonder and ponder what we'll see over the balance of the schedule. And so I thought a good format for today would be to take that 5 takeaway format, and let's talk about some takeaways that we've had from the first 13 games and what they perhaps teach us or suggest about what we'll see moving forward. And also, before we jump into that, I do want to take a quick second. You mentioned the download numbers. And I kind of feel like the end of the year is always a good chance, not just to take stock of the team, but obviously, what we're doing in the show. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who supports the show, who's listened to us, who's tweeted, the show out, who has left a 5-star review, left a comment, a rating. That means so much to us, and all the kind words on the forum as well. So I just want to take this opportunity here as we transition out of 2017 and into 2018 to just thank everybody. Thank you listening right now who make the process of doing this show so special, so rewarding, because obviously we wouldn't do it without you and without download numbers that warrant us doing it. So thank you for making this worthwhile and giving us the opportunity to come on here and talk IU basketball every week.
Absolutely. I mean, I spoke a little bit about those numbers, and it's just been awesome to see. I think times like running together so fat, so much now, as we get older. But I was looking back, I think we started doing this together somewhere around 2014, maybe I want to say. And it's, I've kept a pretty detailed look at the numbers, and it's just awesome to see the growth and the feedback that we're getting. You mentioned the reviews in iTunes; those continue to grow, and I think just word of mouth has really helped, grow the show. People tell other people about us, and it's also pretty cool to see just the number of podcasts in general focusing on IU basketball. I think there's a lot of good content being put out, so it's a great time to be an Indiana fan. Obviously, with the change in the coaching staff and a lot of excitement for the future, but also good from a content perspective. A lot of different people out there putting out great podcasts, great content on the team, and I just think it's really cool how everyone kind of in this community seems to support each other, and it's been awesome to track our continued growth. And I'm looking forward to the next couple of years doing this with you, Jerod. It's something that I don't look at as being work. It's just fun to come on here and talk about the team every week with you, even in the off season. It's something I look forward to every week.
I agree. All right, well, let's hop in here and let's do 5 takeaways from the first 13 games of the 2017-18 Indiana season. I've kind of broken these up into some specific questions. I'll ask you those, Alex, and I'll give my thoughts on them as well. So let's start big picture. What is your biggest takeaway so far about this year's team overall?
Well, I would say every game I write what to expect for the opponent, and I think the biggest thing for me is I have no idea what to expect on a game-to-game basis, which has made it very intriguing, but it's also just made it very hard to kind of understand at times what's going on with this team. You have the highs of obviously playing really well against Duke, and you never want to look at that as a moral victory if you're on the team or on the coaching staff. But I think we can all agree that was one of Indiana's better moments this season, just to see how they could play with the jacked up Assembly Hall crowd, and being able to go toe to toe with the top 5 team was special to see. Obviously the high point, the Notre Dame win to this point, but then you've also had the lows of the blowout loss to Indiana State and Fort Wayne. And I think it speaks a lot to just kind of a program that's in transition right now. There's a lot of positives to draw so far. The play of Juwan Morgan to me has been one of the top kind of storylines of the season so far. But it also speaks to just the roster right now is just not what Indiana needs it to be if it's going to be a perennial contender in the Big Ten. So the ups and downs to me has kind of been my primary takeaway so far.
Boy, that's my takeaway as well, which is just that I don't know that we'll be able to trust this team this year. We saw the loss against Indiana State. We all hoped that you could chalk that up to just first game, new coach, all that stuff. And I think a lot of us were ready, I know I felt this way, to really embrace this team after the Notre Dame win. Like, hey, okay, we got through this gauntlet, we won this game, maybe we've turned a corner. And then you get smacked in the face with that Fort Wayne game, and it was a reminder that with this particular set of personnel, as you go back and think about how a lot of these players played last year, it's just hard to trust them. from game to game. And I think maybe this is Archie's biggest takeaway too, because as he said after the Tennessee Tech game, maybe he needs to be a raving lunatic every day at practice. And I think that, to me, is kind of a manifestation of him realizing, I've got to keep my finger on top of these guys. I've got to challenge them, motivate them. You can't let your guard down. And so it's interesting because you look at the last 2 years of Indiana basketball, and we've kind of reached, the mid-December, late December point, seeing inconsistent teams. Last year's team, obviously beat North Carolina, beat Kansas, but then you have the losses to Fort Wayne and to Butler and some kind of poor performances as you headed into the holiday break. And the team 2 years prior obviously played terrible in Maui, got crushed against Duke. The season looked like it was over at halftime of the Notre Dame game. That team really turned it around and became a trustworthy team through Big Ten play that was really playing good basketball by the end of the year. Last year's team became trustworthy in a bad way, where by the end of the year you could just kind of trust that they weren't going to play well. And so obviously the big difference is that team 2 years ago had, a transcendent player like Yogi Ferrell, NBA talent like, Troy Williams and guys like Max Bielfeldt to kind of anchor it. And this year's team obviously doesn't have that. It seems to be more like last year's team. Hopefully the leadership that we get from the coach, and this kind of, will pull us into the second takeaway. Hopefully that will help steady the ship and this year's team can improve. But as we sit here right now, on December 28th, it's very hard to trust what you're going to see from this team game to game. And at this point, hard to trust that they're going to make huge gains going into Big Ten play, but that's obviously the hope. And now we'll see, what they do out there on the floor as the games continue. So let's use that as our jumping off point for the second takeaway. What is your biggest takeaway about Archie Miller as a coach so far? And, we've only seen him handle, kind of one off season and 13 games so far, but what have you taken away from this time that we've been watching Archie Miller at IU?
I didn't watch a lot of Dayton basketball or Archie as a coach prior to this season, because obviously I'm focused on covering Indiana and tried to do my homework after the job opened on a couple guys who I thought would be good fits, and he was one of them, obviously. But it's been fascinating to me to watch how he interacts with his team on the sidelines, his intensity, and just how focused he is on just being a basketball coach. And I think with kind of what Indiana fans went through the last 9 years with Tom Crean and kind of the ups and downs in terms of how he interacted with fans through the media, some of the things that he said that you couldn't always really get a great feel on what he meant when he said different things. And with Archie, it's a direct to the point message with us, the media, and it's also, to me, a direct to the point message when he interacts with his team on the sidelines. There's not a lot of sugarcoating things. Guys, I feel like for the most part know where they stand, and I just think his style is different and refreshing in terms of just his intensity and how he wants his teams to play. I think right now this team, in terms of the pack line defense, is really struggling with some of those concepts, but that's not to be unexpected just based on how big of a change it is from what was done previously with a lot of these players. But overall, I think I've just been really impressed with just his demeanor on the sidelines and how intense he is, and just how focused he is on just being Indiana's basketball coach and nothing else. I mean, that some people may look at it as, it's more of a lot of PR stuff when you're the IU coach, but I think Archie's done a really good job of handling the media, but also keeping his focus on what it needs to be, which is making this program the best it can be.
Yeah, I agree with you there. My biggest takeaway, and it's been very refreshing after what we saw over previous seasons, is that there is immediate and clear accountability for mistakes of effort and focus. I think Archie is willing to live with a guy, missing some shots or struggling with confidence or being a little bit up and down if he's playing hard and playing with focus. I think we've seen this with Robert Johnson, to name an example, who for the most part has played really hard, really set the example on defense, but he's kind of struggled shooting, and certainly over a couple games there, he struggled with turnovers, and he also saw his minutes go down a little bit because of those turnovers. But I think, you watch a game and you see a guy, not hustle back in transition. You will see Archie be obviously physically like upset, like he just can't handle it, and he will immediately turn and take that guy out. We've seen the same thing with turnovers. Some of those boneheaded live ball turnovers, you have seen the turnover be made and Archie immediately turn around and take a guy out. And I think for a long time, Indiana fans have been frustrated by a lack of accountability when it comes to defense and when it comes to, the kinds of, focus, really bad turnovers or just, diving on the floor, loose balls, defensive rotations, that kind of thing, where everything always seemed like it was based on offense. And now that is different. And I think even though the team has struggled, seeing that and seeing Archie's commitment to accountability for those issues and that foundation he's trying to lay, that has been the most refreshing thing to me. And that's why, there have been some bad losses, there has been some bad play, but seeing the coach set the standard and hold the standard and be consistent about it is really what gives me confidence that even though this season is clearly going to be up and down, and who knows, next season may be pretty up and down too, long term, I really like the foundation and the standard that Archie has in mind for this program, and he's showing that he's willing to hold guys up to it and use playing time as one of the main ways he's going to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so takeaway number 3. Let's talk about, I think, certainly the most impressive individual player and the most consistent individual player this year for Indiana, and that's Juwan Morgan. And I think we all thought that he would step up and certainly he'd have more of an opportunity to produce, but I think he's probably surpassed even the most optimistic expectations for what he would be doing through 13 games. So what is your biggest takeaway based on what you've seen about Juwan's potential for this year and next year as he moves into being a senior?
Yeah, I mean, I've been, as you mentioned, he's been the most consistent player. To me, the most impressive thing about how he's played so far is just him sticking to the role that he can play best and not really trying to deviate much from it. I know people have talked about, if he wants to go to the NBA, he's got to show a better outside shot. Well, right now on this team, what Indiana needs him to do is get to the foul line, score around the basket, and rebound. He's been really, really good on the offensive glass. He's been great at getting to the foul line. He's knocking down his shots. He's shooting almost 65% on twos. And so I've been most impressed with his ability this year just to kind of find the role where he can help the team the most and stick to that role. In terms of his potential, I think going into next season, assuming he's back in Bloomington, which, you don't see his name pop up on a lot of draft boards at this point, I think he really has to embrace that, this not only maybe the second half of this season, but next year, this is his team, his team to be the guy on. And whether that means being the best player next season, who knows, but he can be the most important player because of his leadership. And I think he has the personality, the demeanor, and the voice in the locker room to develop into a guy who is going to have the respect and be able to command a team. And so that to me is the most interesting thing watching him moving forward is how does he grow as a leader, because he was pretty outspoken in the summer, if you remember, talking about leadership not being an issue on this team, and he showed it this year at times, but there's also been moments that have been head-scratching, like the Indiana State and the Fort Wayne loss, where you wonder, Juwan, you talked about in the summer that, those things couldn't happen, and they did, so how are you going to grow as a leader going into the second half of this season and into next season? So those would be the takeaways for me are, watching the future, how he grows as a leader, and also this year specifically finding a role that he's comfortable in, embracing that role, and not trying to do things outside of what he's best at.
Yeah, his numbers are really remarkable. You look at his Ken Pom player profile, and he's in the top 100 in the country in offensive rebounding percentage, in fouls drawn per 40 minutes, in free throw rate. And just for context, you hear that top 100, that doesn't sound that impressive. Well, that's of all players on all, 351 or however many Division I teams there are. So when you're in the top 100, you're really doing something. And then you expand that out a little bit. He's also in the top 200 in offensive rating and in his 2-point field goal percentage, too, along with block percentage. So to be, kind of nationally ranked in such a wide variety of, of elements of performance, from 2-point shooting to blocks to drawing fouls, it just shows how multifaceted his production has been. And so that has been really impressive. And I agree with you. I think, to me, the next step for Juwan is, look, you talk about leadership. I mean, few guys have shown a leadership in terms of production like what Juwan did in the Notre Dame game, where he comes back from an injury, puts the team on his back, and just single-handedly wills them back into that game and then ends up, making the game-winning bucket. He was phenomenal. But I agree with you that there have been some other times, like particularly the Fort Wayne game. I was disappointed with his play in that game. And so I think that's the next step for him, is he's clearly producing, and now I think he's got to be that guy, almost that rock that gets pushed up against when the team is getting ready to, have one of those, bad performances, or it starts out bad, that he's the guy who steps up and says, this isn't happening anymore. And just through hustle plays and grinding it out down low, does enough to kind of get the team going again. And I think some of the times when Indiana has needed that rudder and he could have been the guy, he hasn't been that guy. And now that he's a junior, I think that's a fair expectation. And certainly as he goes into next season, when he's going to need to lead a young team, that would be the case as well. So I think the big takeaway for me with Juwan is he's reached that next level now. Like, he's a consistent producer. He's scoring. He's playing defense, which we hadn't seen over the first 2 years. And a big part of that is obviously because he's healthy. Now I think it's fair. I think he's earned the responsibility of greater expectations now. And I think part of that comes from leadership and just bringing it every single game. And again, he's made great strides, but I think he can take that next step and really fulfill what is a vast amount of potential that I think he has as both a player and a leader. All right. This is a good opportunity, Alex. Let's talk about Hoosier Proud real quick. Because I know we've gotten some great comments in the forum about Hoosier Proud. We've seen some tweets from people who got Hoosier Proud stuff for Christmas. I know I sent a bunch of the members of our team from the Assembly Call shirts, Hoosier Proud shirts, just as a thank you for their hard work over the season. And we've been telling you on Podcast on the Brink about reasons why you should go to HoosierProud.com. They've got great T-shirt designs. If you want officially licensed IU gear, if you want Inside the Hall T-shirts, if you want some of their Hoosier State-inspired designs, they've got a ton of them there at HoosierProud.com. So you really should go browse and check out what they have. Another reason is that they're very philanthropic and they support Indiana-based charities. So a portion of the proceeds from the T-shirt sales will support charities based in Indiana. And of course, they're very, very generous to Inside the Hall listeners, to readers, and to Podcast on the Brink listeners. You get 15% off your entire order by using the promo code BRINK, BRINK. And if I can recommend a particular item that I actually got for myself for Christmas and really liked, they have a long sleeve Indiana T-shirt with the script Indiana on the front. I got the crimson one, and I really, really like it. I like long sleeve tees, but I'm kind of particular about the material and the fit, and I really like the material because it's soft and it fits really well. So I wanted to get that both, because I liked it, and I like getting their products and being able to personally recommend them. And that one I really, really liked. So if you're looking for something particular over there, check out HoosierProud.com and their Indiana University collection, and you will find that shirt.
Yeah, for sure. And the other thing that's really stood out to me about Hoosier Proud is just a level of individual service that you can get from them. If you ever have a question, they're very responsive to inquiries. It's obviously a small business, and you like to, a lot of the reason that people like to support Inside the Hall and Assembly Call is that we're organically grown businesses. We're not a part of a big corporation or anything like that. And the same goes for Hoosier Proud. I mean, this is somebody that's a company that's built themselves from the ground up. They take a lot of great pride in serving their customers, and everyone that I've gotten feedback from that's dealt with Connor and the team over there has had nothing but great things to say. So you can feel good about where you're making your purchase because you know that they're going to do everything possible to give you the best service possible. So the products are great, the service is great. You mentioned the philanthropy, so just a win-win. You help support the show, and you also help support a local business with ties to the state of Indiana. So it's great for everybody involved.
Absolutely. Alrighty, so we've talked about our biggest takeaways about the team overall, about Archie as a coach, and about Juwan Morgan. Let's talk about the sophomore and freshman classes, because I think a lot was expected from the sophomore class heading into the season, because you've got Deron Davis, who is going to be stepping into a new role, Devontae Green, who we all thought would be a really interesting and potentially very good fit with Archie Miller, and obviously Curtis Jones, who is not here. So that's one takeaway, I guess, in another sense, is that Curtis Jones has been taken away from Indiana's sophomore class, or took himself away. And then you've got the freshman class, which there was no real headliner among the trio of Justin Smith, Aljamain Durham, and Clifton Moore. But certainly I think people were intrigued to see which of those guys would be ready to play. And I think through the early part of the season, Justin and Al really flashed, I think, more ability than people perhaps thought, although now we've kind of seen their time on the court start to dwindle a little bit. So, Alex, what is your biggest takeaway overall about Indiana's sophomore and freshman classes?
My biggest takeaway is that if Indiana is going to reach its potential, which I don't know if we've defined what this team's potential is that they need more from several of the guys you mentioned, particularly Deron Davis, who has been very good at times and invisible at times. Devontae Green, who is capable of getting on a run and carrying the team on his back, like we saw there for a brief stretch in the Seton Hall game, but is also shooting only 31.4% on threes, which is just not good enough for a guy who isn't a point guard and is looking to be a scorer on the perimeter for a team that desperately lacks shooting. And then the other thing on the freshmen, I would say, Al Durham has really been the only guy of the three who has been a consistent presence. Obviously, Clifton Moore has not received a lot of time on the court, but when Justin Smith has been on the floor, he's been, lately at least, inconsistent in terms of being able to take care of the ball and finish plays at the rim, and I think that's one reason you've seen Zach McRoberts take over a lot of his minutes. I mean, Justin Smith has played in all 13 games, but if you really look at his game log here lately, his minutes have dwindled, and I think he's still a player that the coaching staff likes a lot for the future, but just some of those inconsistencies he's going to have to clean up to have a bigger role on this year's team. So I would say overall, just as a group, collectively, Indiana needs more from these players if they're going to have a chance to finish 500 or so in the Big Ten.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to narrow the takeaways down here to to just one or two, because there's so many interesting guys among the freshman and sophomore class. I will say, my biggest takeaways deal with the sophomores, because I think those are the guys who are most responsible for production as we move forward. I think what's interesting about Devontae Green is that his overall numbers are down in a lot of ways. His offensive rating is down. A lot of other numbers are down. But he is playing better, much better, against Indiana's better competition. And so I think that's interesting as we go into conference play, where obviously the competition ratchets up. If he can continue to put up the kind of numbers that he's been putting up in Indiana's better games, he becomes a much more efficient and productive player. And we know the key for Devontae is just to smooth out some of those inconsistencies. And so he's a big wild card for me heading into the second half of the season, because he provides a scoring spark. He provides just a mentality and an attacking mentality that I think is missing on this team at times. Unfortunately, it's bundled with some poor decision-making and that inconsistency, like I said. So if he can smooth some of that out, I think that can really help this team. But my biggest takeaway is I think Deron Davis, like Juwan Morgan, I think has taken the next step. And I think it's fair now to expect more. And I know when we think about Deron Davis, and I've had interactions with fans some about this, it can seem a bit like his performance through these first 13 games has been disappointing. And I think part of that is just because of how high expectations were set in the offseason. But, you go through and look at his numbers, and He's playing more minutes this year. His offensive rating is better. All of his field goal percentage numbers are better. He's rebounding better, especially on the defensive end. Assists are up slightly. Turnovers are down by almost half. His block rate is up, and it's 56th in the country. His steal rate is up, so he's more active on defense. He's not committing as many fouls per 40 minutes. His free throw rate is up. The only number, of course, that is drastically down is his free throw percentage, which hurts because he's getting to the line a lot, and hopefully that will go up, and it has been trending upward. So I think Duran has made progress, and he is a much better player and a more well-conditioned player right now than he was last year. But now, like Juwan, I think it's fair to say now it's time to take the next step, and for Indiana to be good in Big Ten play, he needs to. He's playing 48.8% of minutes, which is up from 33.9% last year, but that number's got to go up. He's got to play even more minutes and maintain, basically the same efficiency level. Because if he can do that, man, he gives Indiana another weapon and kind of a rock that it can rely on, especially offensively. But he's been a bit up and down, especially over the last 5 or 6 games. And so I think that's the next big step for him is more consistency and taking on more responsibility to be a guy game after game that Indiana can rely on. Because right now, despite his improvement, he's not that guy yet, but I don't think there's any reason why he can't get there as his sophomore season continues to progress.
I agree with most everything you said. I think the biggest concern is the games where he's basically disappeared and given Indiana next to nothing. Among those games, the Notre Dame game, Indiana was fortunate to win, but he only played 18 minutes and scored 2 points. The Michigan game on the road comes to mind, 18 minutes, 4 points. Seton Hall, 15 minutes on the road, 4 points. I mean, this is your second or third best player. If you expect to win games on the road, if you expect to beat good competition, there has to at least be like a floor for production, and for De'Ron Davis to have those types of performances in those games, that's just not going to be good enough if Indiana wants to, like I said, finish 500 or better in the Big Ten.
Yep. All right, so the fifth takeaway is which individual player needs to make the biggest leap during Big Ten play for Indiana to finish 500 or above. And I think probably for me, the answer to this is De'Ron Davis, and so I'll choose somebody else. And it would probably even be fair, if you wanted to talk about Juwan Morgan here. But outside of those two guys who we've spent a lot of time talking about, which player do you think needs to make the biggest leap for Indiana this year to finish 500 or better in Big Ten play?
I'm going to go with Robert Johnson, with the caveat of I'm only talking really about his offensive play so far. You look at his Ken Palm profile and the 5 games that Indiana has played against Tier A competition, which is really defined as the obviously the better teams on the schedule. He's shooting 6 of 23 on threes, 26%. His turnover rate is 26.3. His offensive rating is 76.6, which is very low, a lot lower than his season to date numbers. I mean, if Robert Johnson can just shoot 40% on 3-pointers in Big Ten play, I think that's going to give a significant boost to Indiana, particularly offensively. And the turnovers, I mean, this is something we've talked about, for the first 3 years with Robert Johnson, but this year his turnover percentage is 23.5, which is the highest on the team, and to have that out of your senior guard who has the ball in his hands a lot and is playing a lot of minutes, I think is something that has to get better. So I'll go with Robert Johnson, with the caveat that I'm only talking about him on the offensive end through 13 games.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many guys who would be fair to state here. Like I said, De'Ron would probably be my guy. I think Robert is really the obvious next choice because and the thing with Robert is the improvements that you want to see out of him are simply him going back to doing things you've already seen. Like, for example, the guy that I want to say is Clifton Moore, and that seems crazy because he's not playing any meaningful minutes. But as I've projected this season forward, I've always kind of thought, maybe he's the kind of guy who you get into January, February, March, that kind of like, OG and Juwan, what they did as freshmen, where they really came in and gave the team a shot in the arm. And I don't, never expected he would have the kind of impact that a guy like OG had. But for a team that's offensively challenged, a big guy like that who can move, shoot it a little bit, if he can get his sea legs, maybe he can become, an important bench scorer. Well, obviously that would be great, but we haven't really seen anything yet to suggest that that is on the way, because it would be asking him to do a lot of things that we haven't even seen on the court. With Robert, all you're asking him to do is basically just get back, to kind of your career averages. We don't even need, 2015 shooting Robert Johnson, where he, got so many wide open looks. If he just shoots like he did last year when he was 38% from downtown, that would be a big step up. If his turnover rate just goes down to what it was last year, that would be a big step up. So, I agree with you about Robert, and it seems so reasonable to expect that could happen, and maybe he settles in and that does happen. I think the other guy who is important is Josh Newkirk. I think it really boils down, if Indiana's going to be successful and be consistent in Big Ten play, the senior guards have got to step up. And I think in Indiana's better performances this year, those guys have played well. And in their worst performances, those guys have really struggled. And we saw Josh Newkirk have a really good game against Tennessee Tech. I don't, take that and extrapolate it out to say he's going to play like that every game, but he has been Indiana's most consistent outside shooter this year. He does have the highest assist rate on the team. And so he's doing some good things. And the hope that I hold out here is maybe Josh is just a slow starter, because he was really inconsistent last year and picked it up and was one of Indiana's best players down the stretch last year, really played a lot better. And so if he can, if he kind of uses, this first part of the season as a runway and kind of gets going and starts playing more consistent, I think that would be really big to get Robert and get Josh just leading consistently and being guys that you can count on, because it's really tough to have a consistent team when, you're counting on one junior and you've got some other young guys that, have potential and step up some games and others don't. And then you're not even sure what you're going to get, especially offensively, from your two senior guards. So I think those guys really need to become more consistent. And if they do, it'll go a long way towards Indiana smoothing out some of its inconsistencies and being a better team in Big Ten play that can go out and compete in almost every game. And there's a lot of parity, and I think that may not be great for the Big Ten as a whole in terms of getting a lot of teams in the NCAA tournament, but it's interesting for Indiana this particular year because it means that there's a whole lot of winnable games on the schedule. There aren't many games you look at and you're just like, man, I just don't really think Indiana has a chance in this one. There's a few, but for the most part, these are going to be winnable games, home and on the road. And if those guys can step up and play well, it's really going to help the Hoosiers.
Yeah, you look at the Ken Palm projections the rest of the way, and I think he's only got Indiana winning 2 more games from the percentage standpoint, but there's a lot of games that are in the 40 to 49% range that can really swing a season. And just a couple of the guys that you mentioned, if they just have minimal increases in terms of their shooting percentages or taking care of the ball in these close 1 to 2 possession games, that can be the difference between finishing with something like 13 or 14 wins or finishing with something like 17 or 18 wins. So it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be a wild Big Ten season for a lot of reasons. The parity that you mentioned, just a lot of teams that are so close to evenly matched. I think every Big Ten team right now is in the top 100 of Ken Palm, but there's a lot of teams from that 40 to 100 range, and there's just not a lot of difference between a lot of those teams, particularly when they come to Bloomington. Indiana's going to have a lot of chances to beat some good teams on its home court and maybe even steal some road games, depending on if they can kind of figure out how to win away from home. They're 0-3 right now in true road games, so we'll get our answer next week when they go to Wisconsin and Minnesota, just to see how much this team has grown from those early season losses on the road. But I think it's going to be a fun and interesting Big Ten season, although I fear that when Selection Sunday comes, and the Big Ten only gets 4 or 5 teams, it's going to be a somber day for a lot of Big Ten fans.
Yes, it probably will be. And one other takeaway, Alex, this is kind of like a bonus 6th takeaway, and we didn't really talk about either of these two guys. And part of it is because, we spent a lot of time about, talking about guys who need to improve. But I think the other takeaway is really how important Colin Hartman and Zach McRoberts are to this team. And part of that is because, they're 2 of the most consistent players Indiana has on a team where so many guys are up and down. And so I think, my other takeaway is those 2 guys need to continue to be consistent. They need to continue to be rocks on which Archie Miller can rely on. And hopefully, other guys step up and they play more consistently. But, Andy Bottoms did a lineup analysis, and I mean, Colin and Zach were in almost all of Indiana's highest performing lineups, and a lot of the best lineups, both of those guys are on the court. And so I think it's so important, those two guys, they don't use a lot of possessions. They're not taking a ton of shots. You don't rely on them a lot for scoring. That's kind of a bonus. But what they provide, just in terms of, getting rebounds and being in the right place defensively and just settling things down, that's my other big takeaway from this season so far is the contributions of those two guys don't often show up in the box score to the magnitude I think that they're felt for this particular collection of players.
Yeah, I agree. Those two guys have been just, stabilizing presences for this team so far, particularly McRoberts. Just kind of the way he's come from not playing altogether for several games to now being a major part of the rotation. He's even scored the ball a little bit the last two games. So it'd be interesting to see how he continues as the competition level picks up here in Big Ten play. But I think Zach McRoberts has been one of the better storylines of the season so far. And it's good also that Hartman's been able to, knock on wood, stay healthy so far and come in, make some shots from the perimeter. You'd like to see him maybe shoot a better percentage here as the season continues to move along. But I think, the one thing as I look up and down this roster is there's not too many guys you look at and say this guy's played above his head or is due for a regression. It's more of like, most of the guys have a chance to play a lot better as the season goes along. So I think that should give fans some optimism that there are some games that Indiana is going to play coming up that maybe on paper they shouldn't win, but they are going to pull out because there's so many guys on this roster who for whatever reason, have not played to their potential so far. And I think there's better days ahead for many guys on the roster. And I think Hartman is one of those guys.
Yeah, and it's fair to wonder if part of the reason why they've struggled is learning a new coach who's drastically different from the old coach and a new system. That seems like a reasonable expectation for why guys, especially some older guys too, might struggle. And I think that gives you something to grasp onto as you look past these first 13 games and into the future, something legitimate, for why this could continue to get better and some reasons for optimism. So a couple other questions I wanted to ask you, Alex, and this kind of goes into more recruiting angle. And I know there haven't been any big updates, from a recruiting perspective, but we've gotten a chance to see a lot of Indiana's incoming recruits now play as their senior years, begin. Guys like Robert Finnessy and Jerome Hunter, Demezi Anderson, Jake Forrester. What has been your biggest takeaway so far about Indiana's incoming recruits through the first part of their high school seasons?
I would say two guys stand out right now, and Demezi Anderson obviously has his team off to a terrific start. I believe they're ranked number 1 in Class 4A, which is probably a surprise to a lot of people. So he would be one, and then 1A for me would be Robert Finnessy, just with how well he's played, scoring the ball. Doesn't have a ton of help on that McCutcheon team, but he's putting up terrific numbers. I think in a normal year, he would be one of, if not the favorite for Mr. Basketball. I think most of us agree that that's going to be Romeo Langford's award to lose. But I think those two guys, to me, have stood out early in the season as the two most notable guys. Jerome Hunter, obviously we've only seen him once, so in person at the Southport game, we had Josh Margolis there getting some video. Interested to maybe potentially see him down the line here later in the season. And Jake Forrester plays out on the East Coast, has had an ankle injury. And he's a little bit overshadowed on his team by Cameron Reddish, who's the number 1 player in the country going to Duke. So he's not the focal point on his high school team, but he continues to put up good, solid numbers from a efficiency perspective. I've noticed a lot of his games where he's shooting something like 6 of 9 from the field, 7 of 10, getting a lot of rebounds. So overall, this has been, I think, a strong start for all 4 guys, a well-rounded group that maybe you don't look at and say there's a superstar in this group. But when you put those 4 guys together with Race Thompson, I think they're going to be a solid foundation for Indiana basketball moving forward.
My biggest takeaway is definitely what Robert Finney is doing from McCutcheon. And it's not a perfect apples to apples comparison, but you consider how Indiana's senior guards have struggled this year, with a new coach and having to take on more responsibility and maybe not as much talent around them as they're used to. Well, Robert's in the same position at McCutcheon. His legendary coach at McCutcheon, Coach Peckinpah, left, and now, Robert is with a new coach. His team isn't quite as good as what it's been, and so he's being asked to really do some different things. He's a guy that's always been known as a pass-first point guard, and he's really having to take on a scorer's mentality this year. And goodness, he's had games of 40 points. He scored, I think, 52 in one game. And so for him to really slide into, he's obviously still the primary ball handler, but to be able to, increase his production to the level that he is, and his assists are still, about the same as they've been. His rebounds are up, his steals are up. For him to do that, I think really shows, that he has perhaps, a wider game, a more well-rounded offensive game than people thought, when he's, he's always been discussed as his pass-first point guard. And so, I know I've seen some comments from people that have watched his film this year and are like, when is he passing? He seems like he's shooting all the time. It's like, well, I don't think anybody really questions whether he can lead a team and be a pass-first guy and do those things. So I think it's actually a real bonus to see him scoring like this, because that was one of the big question marks, and his athletic ability seems to have even improved. So considering how important point guard is and how big of a hole it has been, to me, seeing what Robert is doing this year is just so impressive and so encouraging for the future. And I don't know that it means he's going to be ready to take the ball day one, even though, depending on what the roster looks like, he may be forced into doing that. But it makes me feel better about the point guard position moving forward, seeing what he's doing so far this year. So that's been my biggest takeaway from those guys. And the final recruiting question that I want to ask you, Alex, obviously all Indiana fans asked Santa Claus for a commitment from Romeo Langford. To my knowledge, none of us got that under the tree. I think that would have been tweeted out pretty quickly. So Romeo is still undecided on where he's going to go, choosing between Kansas and Vanderbilt and Indiana. And it sounds like that will, continue on. There's no reason to be on Twitter watch for Romeo's commitment. So I think everybody should just have patience and just enjoy his senior season, because it's a senior season that we may not see for a while again in Indiana high school basketball. So we know he is the clear most important recruit. There probably isn't even anybody second or third. It's that big of a gap. But outside of Romeo, for those Indiana fans that are really interested in following recruiting, who is the most important other recruit that Indiana is going after that they're clearly prioritizing? We've heard names like Trace Jackson Davis and Keon Brooks in state. There's guys like Trendon Watford and Matthew Hurt out of state. Who is the most important recruit for Archie Miller to get, in your opinion, out of the other guys that they are clearly targeting?
I would say Trace Jackson Davis, and I don't really have to think about it too much, because right now I think Indiana and maybe Michigan State have separated themselves from the pack with Trace Jackson Davis. He seems like a guy who could decide sometime next spring. And so to me, he's, a kind of a rare case because of his ability to play inside and out. He's a versatile guy, and I think he's really just scratching the surface of his potential. He hasn't been, a top 50 recruit very long, and now I think Rivals is talking about maybe moving him up to 5-star status if they haven't already done so. So to me, he's the guy who's most important. He's just 45 minutes to an hour away from campus. He's been a frequent visitor to games, and he feels like a guy that Indiana needs to close the deal with sooner rather than later. So I'll go with Trace Jackson Davis.
Yeah, I mean, based on what I know, and it's not a ton about recruiting, I would go with Trace Jackson Davis too, for the exact reasons that you mentioned, because it really seems like his recruiting profile is ascendant. I mean, it seems like his ranking is always going up. People are being more and more impressed by something he's added to his game. So he sounds like a guy that, and he's in state, which is obviously important, and a guy who's been around the program a lot. I mean, he's visited campus and been hanging out around the basketball program a lot. So he seems like a very important guy to get, and we'll continue to follow your coverage on Inside the Hall on all those recruits. You've been doing a really nice job keeping everybody updated, with film and just with updates about how those guys are doing. So I know for folks like me who aren't in Indiana and don't get to see a lot of these guys play, that's really helpful.
Yeah, I actually just got some video this morning sent to me of Jake Forrester. So in the process of going through some of that, and hope to have something up on the site here in the next couple of days, if not sooner. So he's the one guy we haven't seen in person this year, but we've obviously done a lot of video on Romeo, done some video on Finney, Demezy Anderson, Jerome Hunter. So we'll have some video of Jake Forrester from this season. Got a couple of games of his, and so we're gonna have a chance to break that down and put some video together, and like to keep people updated as much as possible on some of the guys coming in. So looking forward to that.
All right, last question. If you had to bet your house on which Indiana team will show up against Youngstown State, do you think it'll be the Fort Wayne Hoosiers or the Tennessee Tech Hoosiers?
I would say the Tennessee Tech Hoosiers, and it's I was writing what to expect this morning for Youngstown State, and decided to keep it pretty brief because if you're expecting anything other than a comfortable win, something has gone totally wrong, because Youngstown State is just, they obviously got a first-year coach and going through a rebuilding process of their own, but they're 2-10, as I mentioned, don't have a win over a Division I team. I think it's going to be a game where Indiana wins and does so comfortably.
Very nice, and hopefully we get a chance to see some of those young guys, because this is the final chance for a game where you look at and you expect a blowout, because after that, like you said, it starts at Wisconsin, at Minnesota, two of our longtime favorite road venues, and then you're right in the heart of the Big Ten season, where there's no more easy games left on the schedule. So hopefully whatever Indiana needs to work out between now and that trip to Madison, they get worked out in that Youngstown State game and get ready. All right, well, Alex, thanks for joining me. It's always fun doing these episodes, and thanks for lending your insight on the Hoosiers.
Yep, happy holidays to everybody. Happy New Year. Won't be until, 2018 when our next episode of Podcast on the Brink comes. So as Jerod said early in the episode, thank you, everybody, for the support. We're really excited about the direction of the show, excited to bring you another full year, 2018, of episodes, and hopefully a lot of fun, exciting things planned for you on the show. I know we're going to try to get some exciting guests in 2018, so hoping it'll be our best year yet of Podcast on the Brink.
Absolutely. Thank you all for listening. For those of you who listen to the assembly call, I will talk to you Friday night after the IU Youngstown State game, and then we'll talk to you again next week on another brand new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Take care, everybody. Happy New Year. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.